In this series of videos, we have integrated a number of perspectives in order to promote a mimetic turn or return of attention to the ancient realizations that we are mimetic animals. One of the goals of the Homo Mimeticus project was to open up an interdisciplinary field of studies we call mimetic studies, and to that end we've engaged in a series of dialogues with influential representatives across disciplines in order to join forces and promote a paradigmatic shift of attention from mimesis simply understood as a copy or representation of reality towards a form of mimesis that is much more embodied, that has to do with mimetic subjectivity. Series of dialogues are slowly coming to an end. I could not fail to return to a city that played a key role in this emergence of the mimetic turn in the first place. I find myself in Parma, Italy, a city where in the 1990s a group of neuroscientists led by Giacomo Rizzolatti made an important empirical discovery, the so-called mirror neuron discovery, that gives empirical support to the hypothesis that we are Homo Mimeticus. Now, this discovery initially did not concern Homo sapiens as such, but our closest cousins, monkeys, in particular macaque monkeys. And like many great discoveries, it happened somehow by accident. Electrodes were placed in the premotor cortex of the brain in order to measure movement. The premotor cortex is an area responsible for movement, and so unsurprisingly there would be a neuronal discharge every time the monkey would operate a movement, let's say reach for a peanut, for example. Now, the discovery was that there was a neuronal discharge not only when the monkey itself would perform a movement, but also as the monkey would be still and would see the experimenter perform the movement and take the peanut, especially goal-oriented movements. There would thus be a mirroring effect in the brain. The area responsible for movement would be activated simply by the perception of movement. Now, in order to account for this disconcerting mirroring phenomenon, Giacomo Rizzolatti and his team coined the concept of mirror neurons, recuperating an ancient concept or an ancient trope that already Plato used in order to define mimesis, understood as a visual mirror or copy of reality, but in order to emphasize that perception is somehow linked to embodiment and to motor actions as well. Therefore, you can see how the theory of mirror neurons is very much in line with the mimetic turn, pushing the emphasis from only representations towards embodiment and mimetic subjectivity. I mentioned Plato in order to give genealogical distance to this recent discovery, but it's important to mention that a number of figures that anticipate the field of mimetic studies, figures like Nietzsche or Pierre Janet, and an entire tradition of hypnosis was already very sensitive to this mirroring mechanism, positing the hypothesis that the simple sight of facial expressions, say of fear or of pleasure, would allow for an immediate unconscious understanding of the other that wouldn't be mediated by a representation or a mental representation of the reason standing behind that emotion. The presence of mirror neurons was found in monkeys and is now confirmed in humans via single neuronal cell measurements. What is still under debate is the specific role that mirror neurons, or as it's called in humans, a mirror neuron system, actually plays in complex social phenomena like imitation, but also emotions like sympathy or empathy, and also more broadly in the field of aesthetics, for instance, as we watch a movie or go to the theater. These are all questions that are central to the field of mimetic studies and that can benefit from a dialogue with the neuroscientists. To that end, I'm happy to be here in Parma in order to have a dialogue with one of the original discoverers of mirror neurons, Professor Vittorio Gallese. He is a professor of physiology here at the University of Parma and was on the team in 1992 as Giacomo Rizzolatti and others discovered mirror neurons. In addition to being a neuroscientist, he is also very interested in philosophy aesthetics and music, since he is an opera singer, and therefore excited to engage in a dialogue with him in order to establish new genealogical connections between mirror neuron theory and the emerging field of mimetic studies. And so maybe the first question that I could have is, in many ways, the discovery of mirror neurons provides an empirical foundation for the hypothesis of this Homo Mimeticus idea that I have, that we are not solipsistic autonomous creatures, but we are relational creatures.
Yes.
And when participating in the discovery of mirror neurons in 1992, I think, was a lot of debate and also a bit of controversies around it. And later, some people spoke of the myth of mirror neurons. We're kind of invoking an old Platonic gesture, saying mimesis, mimetic behavior is just a myth. And also,
there are even people questioning mimesis, for example, neonatal imitation.
So my first question is now, 30 years later, what could we say that is neurologically certain about the mirror neuron system in humans?
Well, first of all, we can say a lot more on mirror neurons in living animals at large, because since our discovery, which, as you said, happened in 1991, the first paper appeared in 1992, we recorded these neurons in macaque monkeys. In the last 30 years, it turns out that this neurophysiological mechanism has been revealed in singing birds, in rodents, mice and rats, in bats, in marmosets, and even at subcortical location. A very recent paper by our colleagues at Stanford University show evidence of mirroring mechanism in the hypothalamus dealing with aggressive behavior. So the very same neurons that are active during the expression of antagonistic behavior also fire when the animal is witnessing the aggressive behavior displayed by another animal. So it is most likely, evolutionarily speaking, a very old mechanism, which nevertheless fulfills, subserves different adaptive roles in different species that have different lifestyle and that have been adapting into different ecological niches. That said, the most exciting part of the story, at least for me and I suppose for you too, consists in the fact that we do have mirror neurons as well, we as humans. And in that respect, since the original discovery and very early on, there was a strong search for empirical evidence of a similar mechanism in humans. The first empirical evidence came from a transcranial magnetic stimulation study performed in Parma. The leading scientist was Luciano Fadiga, showing that there is a motor facilitation in the corticospinal pathway when you observe someone performing hand movements. So you have an increase of the motor evoked potential if you stimulate the motor cortex while participants are looking at someone grasping an object with a hand. Then there was brain imaging evidence, first PET experiments immediately after fMRI that demonstrated that the very same somatotopic arrangement that controls the execution of different body movements can be also activated by the observation of similar body movements performed by someone else. Then, in 2000, together with the American philosopher Alvin Goldman, we went out on a limb, so to speak, and we speculated that the same logic in the human brain perhaps could be uncovered also in the domain of sensation and emotions. And a few years later, we were the first to empirically demonstrate that this hypothesis was correct. The first evidence came from an experiment on disgust, physical disgust, where we showed that the anterior insula can be activated both by the subjective experience of physical disgust, but also when witnessing the facial expression of disgust displayed by by another human being. 1 year later came the evidence about visuotactile mirroring. The second somatosensory area, which is part of the cortical network which maps our tactile experiences distributed in different parts of the body, can be driven also by the observation of a tactile experience on the body of someone else. And that was the major trigger for me to part from the standard traditional simulation theory as put forward by Alvin Goldman, which I thought it was too cognitive, too depending on introspection, on putting yourself voluntarily into the mental shoes of someone else, and came up with the idea of embodied simulation. Embodied simulation, in that respect, constitutes an attempt to provide a unitary theoretical framework for a variety of phenomena, some of which deal with social cognition, so empathy, if you like, intersubjective relation, mapping the action, emotion, sensation of others, but is not confined to the social domain because it also applies to our relation to manipulable objects or to the way our brain-body maps peripersonal space. So it's a more general account of perception and imagination.
Can you say a little bit more about how embodied simulation helps us give an account of phenomena that operate not at the subpersonal level, but at the intersubjective level, like imitation, as you mentioned, but also empathy and sympathy?
I think that our discovery of mirror neurons was instrumental in creating, or at the very least, greatly boosting a particular aspect of cognitive neuroscience, what we now designate as social neuroscience. So the idea that we should map the brain and the body of individuals, particularly when they relate to others. So embodied simulation, I think, provides a very parsimonious functional mechanism that shows how all these different aspects that characterize our social cognition basically rely on a very limited neurophysiological toolkit, namely the reuse of a variety of brain circuits that serve different purposes to guide our navigation in the world, to make us experience our relation to the world, while simultaneously enabling us to imitate others, to understand others, to empathize with others. You mentioned both empathy and sympathy. From an historical point of view, you can see why things got complicated, because the Scottish Enlightenment, namely Smith, spoke of empathy, describing it as sympathy. In my account, empathy and sympathy are two different phenomena. I don't think you can be sympathetic without being empathic, but you can be empathic without necessarily being sympathetic. Being empathic means to feel with the other. Being sympathetic means to feel for the other. So empathy has nothing to do with the Good Samaritan being naturally good or showing the inborn proclivity to do goods to others. I think that you can use empathy to manipulate others, to commit evil acts. So I think we should keep these two aspects of our sociality separate.
And maybe this is the moment to say why I got interested in mirror neurons coming out of philosophy and literature. I was working on a book project with my PhD that was interested in looking at the role of imitation in subject formation in modernist philosophers and writers. And I came across this quotation by Nietzsche in Daybreak, where he says, "To understand another person, that is, to imitate his feelings in ourselves, we do indeed often go back to the reason of his feeling, thus or thus, and ask, for example, why is he troubled? So then, for the same reason, we become troubled ourselves." And then he adds, I think very importantly, I think resonates with your hypothesis of embodied simulation, it is much more usual to me to do this kind of theoretical approach, and instead to produce the feelings in ourselves after the effects it exerts and displays on the other person by imitating with our own body the expression of his eyes, his voice, his walk, his bearing, or even the reflection in word, picture, and music. Then a similar feeling arises in us in consequence of an ancient association between movement and sensation.
Yeah.
Can you speak about the relation between this quote and...
Yeah, I was pointed to this quote by Nietzsche in Daybreak by Humphrey a long time ago. And since then I kept quoting it because on the one hand it shows how poorly original we are. In a way, we keep reinventing the wheel, although at every turn of scientific or technological or theoretical development, you add a new perspective, a new angle. So we can say that we can back up this genial intuition of Nietzsche with empirical evidence through the discovery of mirror neurons, but the same applies to a variety of other intuitions that you can trace back throughout the history of human thought and speculation about who we are, how do we function in the world. And this recurrence of this intuition that sometimes become obscured by theoretical development. For example, this is totally, in a way, coherent with the Einfühlung aesthetics that is blooming in the German-speaking world at the end of the 19th century, in the early decades of the 20th century, with people like Robert Vischer, Wölflin, Völkelt, Warburg himself, which becomes completely obscured in the first half of and until today, in many quarters of aesthetics and art history, because the body completely disappeared, or the body itself is turned into a text. While I would like to hold the opposite statement that any text is a body, literally, because we embody words and sentences by means of mechanisms that are not very much different from those that kick in when we relate with others through our bodily expression, gestures, vocalization, and the like, which is, by the way, where human language originates, if you ask me. Being acquainted with this aspect of Nietzsche's thought and of similar views put forward by other thinkers, in a way, reassured me about the theoretical validity of our empirical discovery, because, I mean, as a scientist, you're always wondering whether the way you are interpreting your data is correct, whether your data can be replicated. So there is always a lot of anxiety in the background related to what you discover, and most importantly, what the data are supposed to mean. I mean, what can you do with those data? What is the heuristic power of this data? And you were mentioning the controversies revolving around our discovery of mirror neurons, and I like to quote a joke put forward by Vilaynur Ramachandra many years ago. Whenever you come up with something new, very new, the first reaction of it can't possibly be true. The second reaction, after a few years, is, okay, it's true, but it doesn't explain anything. And finally, and we are not there yet, oh yes, it's true, it explains a lot, but we always knew it. You see, so we are in the middle of the second phase in a sense. So there are many colleagues that don't want to hear about it, and to the point that in many papers there are people discussing results that are not only coherent with the framework of mirror neurons, but really deal with the very same thing, mirroring mechanism in the human brain, but they don't dare to bring up mirror neurons because they are afraid of rejection. So they come up with alternative way of designating this mechanism like action observation network, even if we are dealing with motor areas. So, I mean, there is another element which probably didn't help in having a more coherent reaction with respect to the heuristic power of mirror neurons, which is the quantity of crap in the public media that revolves around mirror neurons. So mirror neurons became a sort of idiomatic, jargon-like way to designate phenomena that, as I was saying before, cannot be directly linked to mirroring, like being sympathetic, being altruistic, being good, and so much so forth. So this hyper mediatic attention on this neurophysiological mechanism probably wasn't helpful in convincing many colleagues, besides the fact that controversy is a common ingredient of science. So I'm not surprised and not bothered more than a little about the fact that we cannot all converge on the relevance of this mechanism in explaining social cognition.